Hi explorers, welcome to a new video. Today I'm going to talk about Webcomponents, Polymer and how to build a one-page app using these tools. So the agenda for today is talking a little bit about HTML, then a little bit about Webcomponents, Polymer, and lastly I'm going to talk about some projects that I made with Polymer and other people made with Polymer. So HTML then. HTML is awesome. It's quite interesting that we're still using it after 25 years. It has pretty much no programming, no errors, no compilation, and it's very easy syntax, and it can be generated by pretty much any language out there, and it has full area support, so it's fully accessible by everybody. It's platform independent and have a lot of multimedia support, so you can watch both videos and listen to sounds using HTML. So it started somewhere in the 1900s by a guy named Tim Berners-Lee, and the first spec of HTML 1.0 was pretty much the document format. You had links between different documents, you have titles, you have paragraphs and so on, but it was pretty much only text-based and nothing else. And by 95 to 97 you add a little bit more structure to it, you got some form elements so you could actually send data back to servers and interact with the server in a much more meaningful way. And by 1997 we have pretty much gotten every element that HTML has today. We got some new script tags to handle JavaScript, we got some styling tags to have some CSS, and some fonts so we can handle those as well inside of our HTML. Today I don't think that people use the font tag that much. We use the style tag much more heavily, so that might be a little bit on the wayside. And the last HTML spec, the 4.0, added some new elements. Many of them isn't used today and isn't that crucial to the language, but it's good to know that there was some more elements added in the 4.0 standard. And then we have a huge gap from the 4.0 standard until the 5 standard, because the 5 standard is 2014, so that's quite a gap between there. I think it's about 15 years, but in that time we got some more CSS improvements, we got a lot of JavaScript improvements, so might seem that HTML isn't that relevant anymore. But in this new specification they actually added a lot more structural elements, so you could create articles and figures and so on, so you can describe a little bit more about describe your content a little bit more inside of your document. You also have this canvas element, so you can draw in your document. You have SVG, so you can actually create some scalable vector graphics inside of your document. And last but not least, you have audio and video elements that you can use to actually give the document a few different sources to display to the customer. So if you have a customer that is bandwidth impaired, that customer could get a little less of a resolution on their video contra the people that actually have a very good bandwidth, they could get the full HD version. So that's very handy to have. So what's the next step then? Then we come to Webcomponents. Webcomponents is an extension, so it extends HTML with custom elements, so you get your own tags in the HTML document. You have templates, and these are small reusable parts that you can stamp out in your document either as one element tag, could be a part of a template, or you could actually use them in if statements or in for loops and so on. Get more data inside of there. You have HTML imports. These are good for composition, so you can actually take a lot of different elements and they can depend on each other, and you can import the different part required for your document to show. And in this case, you don't have these huge documents with everything that you need. And you can also split them up in a good way, so your caching on the web browser is much more efficient. And last but not least, you have Shadow DOM, which is a technology that encapsulates your component into one part. So in your web browser, you actually see that this component is inside of a Shadow DOM, and everything that is inside of there is only reflecting that element and nothing else. So if you add a CSS property to that element, it will not change the document around it. And if you have some script doing something inside of this document, it will not affect the rest of the document. You could send properties into your element and you could bubble events out of it, but other than that, it's actually one piece that you can't interact with. So, some specifications. The templates is done. By 2014 we actually got a completed specification by Google and Microsoft, which is really good. So it's pretty much implemented in all browsers. And then we have these working graphs. Shadow DOM is the most prevalent. It's most worked on and so on. Custom elements is good second worked on, and HTML imports is a little bit harder to specify because there is actually a bit of disagreement inside of the forums and so on in how to implement this feature. So probably it will be solved in the future, but it's not that important for web components, so I think we are in a good position to go forward. So let's talk about the browser support then. In the browsers, as I said, templates is implemented everywhere. Imports is the one that is a little bit more controversial, so only Chrome and Opera has implemented it. Custom elements is implemented in Chrome, Opera, Firefox, and Safari has a development branch with it with this feature inside, and Edge is still considering. And last, we have the Shadow DOM, which is actually stable in Safari. It's stable in Opera and Chrome, and Firefox has a development branch for it. And I'm thinking that Edge is considering to actually implement this feature next. So this is the movement of the web component people, because when you are creating web components, you go back to actually give more responsibility back to the browser, because how we build our applications today, we use a lot of different JavaScript libraries and frameworks and so on, and then we bundle it up into large files, sometimes up to 2 megs and so on, and then we send those off to the browser, which could be a mobile phone on the bandwidth impaired network with very small memory and not much CPU. And this is not a good way to handle your resources. So if you can give some of that responsibility back to the browser and actually send just the thing required to render your page, that would be a great improvement. So by going to web components, you can have more of the framework inside of the browser and less of the code sent over the network. So this is the slide for that. Keep calm and hashtag use the platform. So Polymer then. What is Polymer and how can we use it? First off, we're going to talk about the tooling. There's a very good tool called Polymer CLI that you can use to work with your Polymer project, and almost all of these tools could be downloaded separately and handled in a gulp project if you like, because all of these are separate tools, but the Polymer team has bundled them together in one tool to make it easy for you. So if you download the CLI, you can build your project, and then you will get a bundled version, and this bundled version will actually bundle all your components in one file that you send over network. And if you have routing in your application with different pages, those routes will be different fragments inside of your application. And this bundled version is good for one-page apps where you want to send most of the data over the network in the first go, because you know that the web browser will require all of it. But another way to do it is the unbundled version, where every component has its own file compressed, and you send just that file. And if your browser supports push, you can actually push all the files and then cache them on the browser side, which will enhance your transfer speed as well. And then we have a linting tool that it's pretty self-explanatory. Test uses Selenium to test your code, and if you bootstrap a component, you get some test files and so on already in your project, so you don't have to set that up separately. You get that for free. And then you have the serve. Serve actually starts a web server, and it makes it possible for you to change on the fly different things in your components and just re-render it in the browser to see the different changes. And init is the way to bootstrap different parts. You have the components, as I talked about. You bootstrap a component, then you will get all the things required to do work on a component with testing and documentation and so on. And you can bootstrap a news application. This is a trial or something that you could take inspiration from, and it's pretty much a news site built by the blog way. So it looks a little bit like WordPress, but it's nicer, I think. Then you can bootstrap an app that will give you the full app GUI with a responsible menu and also all the different parts you need to do routing and a few pages. So that's quite good to have as well if you want to have something to start from. So how do a component look then? We have this value pair component that I built. It's a very basic component. As you see up on the right in this picture, you have the update date and an actual date. That's the visual demo of my component, and underneath you see the tag that will make that component display this value. And this value pair demo actually has localization inside of it. And the way it works is that you give it a label and a value, and it will display that label localized with the value. And you can also have a placeholder that is displayed if that value is not present. On your left hand side underneath you see the actual documentation of this component, which is also nice to have. And both the demo and the documentation is rendered for you, so you get this for free. If you only add some information in your source code, you actually get a fully documented and a follow demoable component for free, which is very nice. This is the component structure, and this component has first off your links to the different Polymer components that is required to build your component. In my case, I only have the Polymer import, but you can have a lot of imports with different components that you like to have dependencies to and use in your component. And then we have this tag DOM module, which is encapsulating my component, so it knows actually where my component is in the DOM, and could use that when it takes CSS, JavaScript and so out, and compile it and pushes it back again, so it has a placeholder where it should put the different things. And then we have our template with the styling, and the style element could include custom styles, and you could have just regular CSS to style this specific element, and after the style you just put your normal HTML code to show your component information, or you can use another component, so you build components inside of components. And then we have the script. So let's look a little bit more at the script then. This is a script for the 1.8 or 1-point-ish structure, and here we add this is to say that this is an icon toggle, and that will connect to the DOM module that we saw earlier. So that is value of that component should be the same as the is value for this component or this script, so they can find each other. And our properties could look a little bit like this. Either you have the short notation where you show toggle icon is a string, or you have a little bit longer notation where you have pressed, and then you say that the type is boolean, the value is false, and then you say if it should notify or reflect to an attribute. And notify is that this specific property should notify all other components that this property is used inside of this document. So if you, or inside of this component, so if you use this property on a lot of places inside of this component, it should notify all of those components that this value has changed. Or if you have the reflect to attribute, it's the other way around. If this component gets the pressed value, or the pressed value is set in this component, then it should reflect changes back out of the component to the attribute of this component. And another part of the script, which is really nice, is the listeners and observers. The listeners is a part of the component where you specify which events you listens for and which function this listener should trigger if it happens. And the observer pattern is a little bit different. Here you can actually say that, in my case I have this values changed function, and it will be triggered if either the variable change or the title inside of the object item changed, or if any value in the collection changed. So this is a very powerful way to describe declaratively how to trigger a specific function, which is very nice when you are building event-driven applications. And then we talk a little bit about how to use your custom element. You have a value pair, as we talked about earlier. I give it a language. In this case, it's a value that is bound one way, so no changes could come back from a reflect to attribute, for instance. And then we have the last updated, which is just a string, and this value where you have the curly brackets, that's a doubly bound value, so if we have reflect back to attribute, that could change. And the placeholder is just a string as well. So this is a way to see how a component could be used inside of your document. But it also have changed a little bit recently, because this specification for Webcomponents 1 is done and implemented, and the way that Polymer actually was thought to work is that they wanted to remove functionality as when web components mature and when they get functionality that Polymer has, they want to remove that functionality from Polymer So they will work more like the standard vanilla web component, and less of the work is done in Polymer. So a vanilla web component extends the HTML element class, and the Polymer element extends that class as well, so it gets all the different functions and all the different attributes of that class. And that class has a lot of different callbacks. We have the connected callback, the disconnected callback, the attribute changed callback, and so on. So why do Polymer still have this extra extend? What does Polymer give us extra? Well, if you like to do, as I explained earlier, we use the different properties, the observers, the listeners, and so on. If you want to use that structure and that functionality, then you have to actually implement that functionality, because the properties inside of a vanilla web components, you just get a call to the attribute changed callback if an attribute changed. So you don't get this nice declarative way of describing observers, listeners, and properties. So if you want that extra functionality, then use Polymer in the Web 2.0 standard, or in the Polymer 2.0 standard. And if you don't require that, then just use the vanilla web components. They are still great, and you can do a lot with just them. So that's what I wanted to talk about here. So Polymer then, a lot of elements. They have actually structured the Polymer elements into different groupings. We have the app elements, and these are used to build your applications. So you have routing, you have localization, and so on in that package. You have the iron elements, and these are more of a functional kind. You have some iron IX, for instance, to fetch things from the network, and iron icons, which could take any SVG and display that as an icon. And the paper elements, these are material design elements, so you can actually just add a paper input or a paper select box, and they will be designed well in the material design sense, so you get an application that looks pretty good from the beginning. And then you have the Google Web Components, and these are your usual maps and all the Google APIs, so you can use those there. You have your gold elements, and these are e-commerce, so there's your card number validation, your CVC number validation, and so on. Neon elements, you have some animation in that block, so you can actually build buttons that animate up and down, so you can have these nice round buttons that you click on to display a new page. You have your platinum elements, and these are for offline, so you have push notification or caching and so on, so those are quite nice. And then you have the custom element block, which is the community has built a lot of third-party components. So at Custom Elements IO, you can find over 2,500 repositories by over 1,000 authors. So that's a really good resource if you want some more functionality that you don't find in the standard library. So the starter kit that I said earlier that we could bootstrap, and we used that to create our application. It starts off by having a responsive design, so you have this responsive menu, and it actually looks very nice on a mobile phone. And if you keep building your site with these guidelines in mind, you will have a good application that could be displayed on all different devices. It has modular routing, so you actually get all the pages and so on that I talked about earlier, so you get that for free. Localization, and that's handled by a JSON file where you add your different locales and all the translations between a label and the actual value that you want to show. You have offline support using a service worker, and the service worker could actually be in between your browser and the network. So the service worker first give you, if you have already been to the page, the service worker will give you the old version of the page, and you can have that version and work with that version while the service worker is going out to the network and fetching a new version of your site, and then you can use the new version. And this will make your users feel that your application is much faster and nicer to work with, especially if you have a very large application. And everything in the starter kit is component based. Last, I want to talk a little bit about projects, different things that I have been a part of, and also other people and what they have built with Polymer. So this project is something that I was a part of. My company TextTalk, together with the Department for Accessible Media, built this site to create newspapers and other material that is read by different producers, and then they want to bundle this into different issues that they could give their subscribers. So this tooling will help you build issues with different audio content, and it also has a small client that syncs your actual data up to the cloud, so we could help you build these issues, and you could get them in a lot of different formats. So this website is pretty much the small part of the tooling. Much of it is in the servers behind and all the work that those do. So this website is just something that we built upon a REST API, and to show off the issues and enable the producers to go in and change the order of things, and perhaps change some visual content such as titles or descriptions for different audios and so on. So this is what we built using Polymer. And what I've learned during this project is that Polymer is very good for prototyping. I actually heard about this project and saw a little bit of a PowerPoint, how it, or yeah, some design document, how it should look. And I took that and spent a couple of days and built a pretty working prototype using a small JavaScript backend, and yeah, it was pretty much up and running and looking, yeah, pretty good. And by showing off this prototype, it actually won the race. So we went forward and built our application in Polymer. So that's really nice. If you want to build something fast, you can actually use Polymer to show off. And the good part is that everything is already styled. So me as a backend developer and not a designer could actually create something that looks pretty good. If you send a real designer and looking at the first draft that I built, it was not that good. But if you just look at it as a whole, it worked, and it doesn't look outdated. So another thing I learned was that properties go down and events go up. And that was something that I heard when I was at Polymer Summit. Sadly, Polymer Summit was after we built the application. So I was sent to Polymer Summit, I think a few days after we went live. So I had to learn that the hard way. Another thing that I learned the hard way is that some of the community built components might not be production ready from day one. We did a lot of pull requests to the community, and the community was very responsive, so we actually got a lot of them in. But if you want to have something that is stable from the start, maybe you should keep to the actual Polymer library and stay away from the third-party components, maybe. Another thing that I did was I built a routing that were many layers deep, and that made things a lot harder for me. So if you can keep your routing as shallow as possible and keep all your variables local, that will make things easier for you. So if you need a deep structure, it's better to have one route going to one page, and then that page has its child routes inside of it, instead of trying to create a monstrosity that handles all of the routing in one page, or one component. That's not a good idea. And I also learned that you never know what components you need. The value pair components you saw earlier was one of those I built quite early in the project, and by the end we had scrapped that component because it was never used. So you can build a lot of components, and some of them are good and some of them might not be required. But yeah, and separate your responsibility is always good. Keep everything local to a component, and if you need to handle something outside of the component, then send an event to another component, or give this component some properties if you are so inclined. But don't make any component that is the controller for all other components. That will not work well for you. So who is using Polymer then? Google is using Polymer, of course, because they built it, and as I know by now, they use Polymer for the Google Gaming product. They also use it for the developer tooling site, and they also have the draft out for the YouTube remake. I've seen it, and hopefully that will go live as well. And then we have Battlefield 1. That web page is built in Polymer. Zeppelin, a design tool, is also built in Polymer. And USA Today was at Polymer Summit and talked a lot about their implementation of Polymer. And they actually started their project 2 months before the Olympics. And they went to different colleges and so on, and hired a lot of new people into the company to actually handle the big site they wanted to create. And they were actually able to produce a site to the Olympics and then add extra components to the site as the Olympics went on to show different stats and so on. So they were quite happy with that solution. And the next time they had a project, which was the USA election, they did the same thing again, 2 months, and a lot of people working together. And I must say that web page was also quite nice, and you could actually follow live how the different values in the election changed. So yeah, well done, and they actually made something really good with Polymer. So that's who's using Polymer today. And if you want to start with Polymer yourself, you should look into the polymerproject.org. There you have a lot of information about the Polymer project, and custom elements IO. There you can find all the custom elements that I talked about earlier. And if you want to build just vanilla web components, then you have the vanilla or the webcomponents.org that you can look into. I hope this video was informative and that you learned something today. Please leave me a comment or a like, and I hope to see you in the next video.